Good evening. Welcome. I am Professor Erani Ramugondo, the outgoing chair of the Academic Freedom Committee at the University of Cape Town. Welcome to the 2020 TB Davie Memorial Lecture, which, thanks to our current COVID-19 global context, is hosted virtually for the very first time. Those of you who are in the academy will appreciate that virtual engagements have now become our new normal. I'm not entirely certain about who exactly is in the room tonight, except for members of the UCT Council, UCT members of Convocation and Friends of UCT, the University Executive, members of the Senate and the Academic Freedom Committee, and of course, those I know amongst you as scholars across generations, colleagues, students, friends, and family. I welcome you all. We have been advised that almost 600 people signed up for this virtual 2020 TB Davie Memorial Lecture. These numbers are extremely pleasing and tell us that both the speaker and the topic caught your attention. Like you, I'm looking forward to a deeply engaging evening where we explore a very timely and necessary topic of our times: economic inequality and academic freedom. After a few introductory remarks, we will invite our speaker, Professor Ravi Kanbur, to the fore. He is joining us virtually from the United States of America. Of course, from a completely different time zone where it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon right now. After the delivery of the lecture, we will have a question and answer session. You would have noted already an invitation in the chat room for you to submit your questions as you listen to the lecture. I will be reading these questions out as part of the Q&A session. I now hand over to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, to welcome you officially to the University of Cape Town.
Thank you very much, Professor Elelwane Ramugondo, Chair of the Academic Freedom Committee here at UCT, and her fellow members of the committee, students, colleagues, alumni, and friends. And a special welcome to Mebaba Lwangonyama, our Chair of Council, as well as Ms. Makanyile, who chairs our University Finance Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, Goeienaand, Molweni, and welcome to this 54th TB Davie Memorial Lecture, which is hosted by the Academic Freedoms Committee at the University of Cape Town. My name is Mamokgethi Phakeng. I'm full professor of mathematics education and the 10th Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town. Because this lecture is being delivered online, we have the opportunity to join with people from all over the world this year. And as Professor Ramugondo said, we have logged 589 RSVPs, including many from our alumni and friends of UCT overseas. I'm so glad that you can join us. The need for social distancing has created many physical limitations, but we can still share the space of ideas. The annual TB Davie Memorial Lecture is organized by the Academic Freedom Committee at UCT, which is a committee of council. Distinguished speakers are invited to discuss a theme related to academic and human freedom. Tonight's lecture, to be presented by Professor Ravi Kanbur, will explore the implications of rising economic inequality for academic freedom. We are witnessing almost on a daily basis how COVID-19 is increasing economic inequality around the world. So this topic is very timely. Measuring inequality through statistics and investigating the deep impact of economic inequality on a person's self-image are very different ways of understanding this tragedy. Every lived experience is unique, and statistics do not tell the whole story. And as we all know, statistical data does not speak for itself. It is always given a voice by the researcher. I always argue that the researcher is the most important instrument in research. Doing research, therefore, requires that we, as researchers, even within our freedom to explore questions that are of interest to us, we have to take responsibility, not only for how we conduct the research, but also how we interpret the findings and how we present those findings. For instance, we need to consider what preconceptions we bring to our investigation. Yes, we all bring preconceptions to our investigations, and how our attitudes may affect the people we are surveying, how we address our questions to them, as well as how we present our findings. This is one reason why we submit to academic critiquing of our work as academics. As researchers, we need to take the time to understand not only who we are questioning, but what they are telling us in response, but the background and context of our questions and their responses. Last month, we invited Colin Coleman to present VC's open lecture, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs for Sub-Saharan Africa. And he presented a 10-point plan for reducing the economic gap in South Africa. Whether you agree with Mr. Coleman's recommendations or not, the message that stands out is that life after COVID will not be a return to business as usual. Well, I can hear some of you saying, well, is there life after COVID? I'm assuming there is. I'm saying it will definitely not be business as usual. A change is needed, not only in South Africa, but around the world. At least part of that change will involve how we view economic inequality, how we investigate it, how we report on it, and how we address it. I want to congratulate the members of the Academic Freedom Committee and Professor Ramugondo, the outgoing chair, for their commitment to this valuable support of academic freedom. Thank you for opening this UCT platform to a different voice today. I now call on you, Professor Ramugondo, to introduce to us this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for those poignant introductory remarks. And once again, greetings everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you tonight for the 2020 TB Davie Lecture on Academic Freedom, Professor Ravi Kanbur. Professor Kanbur researches and teaches in development economics, public economics, and economic theory at Cornell University, United States of America. Born in India, he later, during his upbringing, straddled his country of birth and the United Kingdom. While in Britain, he gained his degree in economics from King's College, University of Cambridge. He studied further for his master's and doctorate, also in economics, at Worcester College, University of Oxford, under the Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Amartya Sen. Sen names Kanbur among his PhD students who influenced his writing on social choice theory and welfare economics. Professor Kanbur is well known for his role in policy analysis and engagement in international development. He has served as chief economist for Africa at the World Bank. His research has been published in leading economics journals, including Journal of Political Economy, American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies, Journal of Economic Theory, and the Economic Journal. He is currently co-chair of the Food System Economics Commission, a global non-profit organization dedicated to transforming the global food system into one that is fair and sustainable. He is also the co-chair of the Scientific Council of the International Panel on Social Progress, a group aimed at developing research-based, multidisciplinary, non-partisan, action-driven solutions to the most pressing challenges of our time. Some of Professor Kanbur's previous positions include being chair of the board of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, president of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality, and member of the core group of the World Bank Commission on Global Poverty. I know that Professor Kanbur is not planning to refer to this at all in his talk today, but it is stated somewhere that in May 2000, yes, 20 years ago, he resigned as director and lead author of the World Bank's World Development Report. This followed the online publication of the initial draft of the 2000-2001 report. Professor Kanbur had insisted that the report, in describing anti-poverty strategies, must emphasize empowerment, which means increasing poor people's capacity to influence state institutions and social norms. Security, which means minimizing the consequences of economic shocks for the poorest. And opportunity, access to assets, in that order. The final version of the report, although it still contained the three central pillars of empowerment, security, and opportunity, the order was, however, reversed to opportunity, with emphasis given to market-driven economic growth and liberalization as ways of reducing poverty, empowerment, and lastly, security. My reference to Professor Kanbur's resignation is really to highlight his strength of character, as this resignation was clearly driven by principle. It could not have been easy. It took courage. Professor Ravi Kanbur is known to be very keen on interdisciplinary work and has been a visiting professor during 2020 at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, where Einstein, of course, was. At IAS, Professor Kanbur is working on the two-way interaction between economic ideas and economic policy. He has been exploring this interaction through the work of three economists, John Maynard Keynes, W. Arthur Lewis, and Gunnar Myrdal. In this work, he draws parallels between the modern era and the evolution of the discourse around the Washington Consensus. Despite his interdisciplinary focus, Professor Kanbur is also widely accepted as one of the early economists to inject the use of formal models into development economics. He is probably one of the leading development economists in the world working on poverty, inequality, and welfare dynamics. He has a close and fond relationship with South Africa, having published extensively with UCT colleagues on minimum wages and compliance. One of the recent highlights in Professor Kanbur's academic life and global presence as a thought leader was a paper presented at the International Monetary Fund Conference on Achieving Inclusive Growth in Seoul, Korea, on the 29th of November 2018. The paper was entitled, "Are we living in an age of rising inequality?" No, but yes. This is a paper worth reading in order to get to grips with both global and regional trends of inequality. While the world grapples with the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on economies across the globe, as our Vice Chancellor has already alluded to, there's been a focus on the great disparities that persist in our communities. Higher education is, of course, not immune to this, and we have seen how this finds expression within the academy. Professor Ravi Kanbur's TB Davie Memorial Lecture this evening under the topic Economic Inequality and Academic Freedom is indeed very apt. Professor Kanbur, over to you.
Gosh, well, thank you very much indeed. There's only one way to go after that, isn't there? It's thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and my thanks to the Vice Chancellor, and of course to the Chair of the Academic Freedom Committee for this very kind invitation to deliver the TB Davie Memorial Lecture. He was a remarkable man with ideals for the ages, and I'm very pleased and honored to be delivering this lecture. Let me share my screen with you, and we can start the lecture. So, so my title is Economic Inequality and Academic Freedom. So I should start by saying what this lecture is about and what it is not about. The term academic freedom these days invokes controversies on freedom of speech, on deplatforming, cancel culture, and so on. These are, of course, very important debates, but they are not the focus of this talk. And it's for the simple reason that they're not the area of my knowledge and expertise, so I cannot speak to those issues. Rather, my focus in today's talk will be on the role of economic resources in determining opportunities in academic education and research, freedom in the positive sense, and I'll clarify what I mean by freedom in the positive sense. Oh gosh, what I'm going to do in this lecture is to develop three broad propositions. First, that economic inequality begets academic inequality, which in turn sustains economic inequality. Second, that economic inequality curtails positive freedom and positive academic freedom. And third, that to enhance positive academic freedom, policy should target general economic inequality as much as specific academic inequality. So that's the broad outline. I'm going to start with the economic inequality and academic inequality and talk about economic inequality first and academic inequality. Then I'm going to talk about freedom, in particular positive freedom, and the links between inequality and positive freedom. And finally, I want to take up the issue of whether one should target economic inequality in general or academic inequality in particular. So that's the plan. So let me start with some preliminaries. And since my topic is economic inequality, really we have to talk a little bit about measurement of economic inequality. And I suppose in any discussion of inequality, one has to start with the questions inequality of what and inequality between whom. And the what is straightforward, since it's economic inequality. It's going to be economic magnitudes that are going to be my focus, like income or consumption or wealth. And of course, there are a host of technical issues here. For example, price corrections. Clearly, 1,000 rands in a rural area is not the same as 1,000 rands in an urban area. And the situation gets much more complex when you're looking at cross-country comparisons as well. And there are big debates on this, which I'm not going to get into here. The second thing is inequality between whom. And the typical practice in economic analysis and indeed in terms of national data and so on, is to focus on differences in economic magnitudes across individuals. And again, there are a host of technical issues here. For example, how do you think about differing needs across individuals, across adults and children, and men and women, and so on? And there are big debates, big debates, technical debates in this area. And finally, if we've decided on the what and the whom, then how do you actually measure? How do you actually measure the spread? What statistics do you use? And there are these well-known statistics: the Gini coefficient, the mean log deviation, and so on. And again, there are very big debates as to whether one particular measure is better than another particular measure, and so on. also a debate in the economics literature on the economist's instinctive fallback on the individual as the basis of inequality between whom. And this ties in methodologically to the methodological individualism which underpins economic analysis. But of course, economic inequality across groups is a key feature of most societies. These groups are defined most obviously by gender, race, ethnicity, caste, religion, language, region, and of course, crossing these groups creates new groups. And this, of course, corresponds to the distinction between vertical and horizontal inequality in the literature. One way of marrying the traditional focus in economics on inequality across individuals with the clear salience of groups is to decompose overall inequality among individuals into two components. That accounted for by inequality between groups, and that accounted for by inequality between groups. We can then ask what fraction of overall inequality is accounted for by the between group and the within group components to provide this particular group-related perspective on inequality. Well, there are all these debates, but national statistical offices and international organizations have to resolve these in some fashion to produce those headline numbers which all of us use, despite the fact that we criticize them, and we should criticize them. So having these numbers then, I want to ask, what broadly are the trends in inequality in the world as a whole? In particular, I want to pose the question, are we living in an age of rising inequality? Well, to read the general discourse, you would think that the answer has to be yes. Obviously, we're living in an age of rising inequality. And this narrative is indeed backed up by outcomes in several large countries from the 1980s, 1990s onwards, basically over the last 30 years or so, including, of course, the USA, China, India, and so on. Thus, a large share of the world's population actually lives in countries where economic inequality, as conventionally measured along the lines that I've been discussing, has in fact been rising over the last 3 decades or so. However, I do want to point out that global patterns on outcomes of inequality are more nuanced than this. And I think as technical analysts, we have to be aware of this. At the same time as inequality was rising in some countries, it was steady or actually falling in others. Till about 5 years ago, for example, the general Latin American experience had been, in the previous decade and a half, of falling inequality as conventionally measured. The levels of inequality were still, of course, relatively high, but the trend was decidedly downwards, bucking the usual characterization of Latin America as being the poster child for high and rising inequality. In fact, for a decade and a half to 2 decades, inequality in Latin America actually fell. So overall, as I quote Hassel here, who works on the data on this thing, or in this area, he says, it's a mistake to think that inequality is rising everywhere. Over the last 25 years, inequality has gone up in many countries and has fallen in many others. It is important to know this. And actually, even in China, which is again the poster child for rising inequality, and in fact, 25 years ago, Xiaobo Zhang and I joined a group of researchers to point out the sharp rises in inequality that were happening in China. But in our recent work, we've argued that there may be signs of a deceleration of the rise, a plateauing in the second half of the 2010s. So, are we living in an age of rising inequality? Now, if by this is meant that income inequality is rising everywhere and anywhere, that claim is empirically easily dismissed. There are significant parts of the world where actually it is not rising and it has been falling. But in my writings, I've argued that we shouldn't be lulled into some sort of false sense of security by this, because there's actually a more fundamental sense in which we are indeed living in an age of rising inequality. And I just read what I said here is that inequality is not rising everywhere, but there is indeed a sense in which we are living in an age of rising inequality, which goes beyond the Piketty argument that rising inequality is a natural state of capital accumulation in a capitalist economy. And it is this: the trend of technological progress is to displace basic labor in favor of skilled labor and capital. Such labor-saving technical change, also called skill-biased technical change, has been the hallmark of the world economy for at least the last 3 decades and looks set to continue in the decades to come. But if the fundamental forces of capital accumulation and technical change are making for rising inequality, what explains the variations? Why is it rising everywhere? The answer, I've argued in my writings, is policy. Policy matters. Those countries which have had some combination of redistribution of market-generated incomes and what is typically referred to as pre-distribution, in other words, reducing the inequality of physical and human capital, human assets, with which individuals enter the marketplace, countries which have had some combination of these two have mitigated the underlying forces. In some cases, they've actually managed to have a decrease in inequality. In other cases, they've held back the forces. And the second of these, the addressing of human capital inequality, inequality with which individuals enter the market, leads us to the question of education inequality, and that I now move to my next section. So, academic inequality is also very interesting. This is something to be recognized by analysts and technicians, that by and large, quantity-based measures of education have actually improved in the world over the past half-century. Primary school enrollment, for example, has increased in most countries, and the gender gap has closed. Systematic data is compiled, for example, by Rosa and Ortiz Ospina, shows that the Gini coefficient of the years of schooling, the inequality of the years of schooling, is lower in younger generations than in older generations, and that on average, there's been a remarkable decline in overall education inequality as a global phenomenon. And I think as analysts, we have to recognize this and appreciate that this has happened. However, having said this, there are 3 important caveats to this assessment. First is a sort of a technical mechanical point, because of course there's no upper limit to income, but there is an upper limit to the years of formal schooling. And there's a tendency for inequality to decline as enrollment rates rise from the bottom up. There's no way for the top to go, there's only one way for the bottom to go, and it has indeed been improving, so inequality measures, as conventionally measured, have been falling. Second, important caveat is that the quantitative assessment is exactly that. It's an assessment of the quantity of education, not of its quality. And third, extremely important for my argument, is that what is important is who's getting the increase in education. In other words, what is the link between household economic resources and educational attainment? And this also matters. Now, there is widespread evidence that educational achievement in terms of level and quality is indeed very well correlated with economic resources of the household of the student. I mean, there are hundreds of these papers, and almost at random I picked one, but here it is. Okay, let me just read the conclusion of that. This is a paper by Illy and Rose. Analyzing demographic and health survey data, as many of you will know, DHS demographic and health survey data are a major source of socioeconomic data. Data from 35 low and middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, they show wide wealth inequalities, with few, if any, of the poorest gaining access to higher education in some countries. We further identify that wealth and gender inequalities interact and tend to be wider where levels of higher education are higher. This implies that access to higher education may predominantly benefit the better off unless measures are taken to tackle inequalities. I mean, this is just one paper of many, many, many in the literature which has these sorts of conclusions. And these same tendencies are present in the higher education sector in rich countries. OECD has done a lot of studies on this. And the US is a case in point, where I'm based. The US used to have a narrative of in the immediate post-war period, in the 3 decades after the Second World War, that higher education expansion played an important role in mitigating economic inequality. It was known as the race between technical progress and education. and education expansion one, so to speak. And that was a narrative of the declining inequality in the US in the first 30 years or so after the Second World War. But this narrative has now been replaced by the role of the higher education sector in maintaining and propagating inequality in the last 3 decades. This is a recent comprehensive analysis by Raj Chetty et al. and his colleagues. This is based on data from over 30 million college students in the US in the last decade and a half, from 1999 to 2013. And it arrives at the sobering conclusion that children whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution are 77 times more likely to enter the Ivy League than those whose parents are in the bottom quintile. So, this is quite remarkable. And I just pick one sentence from Chetty. There are many, many such conclusions, and there are many, many studies which have these sorts of conclusions for the rich countries as well. I make a point here now, which I will take up later on in my talk. It's also quite remarkable that in the US, these elite private universities, which cater disproportionately to students from high-income families, do not pay tax on income from their significant endowments. The endowment is $38 billion for Harvard, and it is $7 billion for my own university, Cornell University. So not only do these universities get the return from these endowments tax-free, donations to these universities from wealthy individuals attract tax breaks for these wealthy individuals. And I'm going to return to these tax breaks because I'm going to argue there's a close link between academic inequality and general economic inequality along these lines as well. These inequalities in education, and in higher education specifically, reflect, so that's my point, that inequalities in education and higher education reflect economic inequality, but the next point is that they're also propagated. This is particularly so in this era of skill-biased technical change, where the rates of return to each additional year of education, the income rates of return to each additional year of education have increased dramatically with technical change, and they've done so more so at high levels of education. So each additional year of education gets you a premium. That premium has been increasing, and it's increasing at an increasing rate at high levels of education. This is a perfect storm. And the overall effect is that inequalities in higher education are one of the forces that are making for the rising inequality that I talked about earlier. And these fundamental forces of technical change, which are displacing basic labor in favor of educated labor and in favor of capital, not only are they strong, but they're strengthening. And academic inequality is thus part and parcel of economic inequality in general, both as cause and as consequence. I want to begin the task of linking it to academic freedom by starting with a discussion of freedom in general. Now, of course, this is a vast topic, vast topic, with interpretations within interpretations, and it's likely to get one lost in a maze of semantics. For me, it's useful to start, as with inequality, by asking the what and the whom questions. Freedom of what and freedom for whom? On the whom question, the bulk of the literature, certainly that I'm familiar with, focuses on the individual. This is not to say that collectivity is not important for freedom, but that it's individual freedom which is a subject of interest and discourse. Well, what is this individual freedom? And in my own work, I've come across this, and I've addressed this with reference to the work of two people in particular, the philosopher Isaiah Berlin and the economist Amartya Sen. Isaiah Berlin famously introduced the concepts of negative and positive freedom. These basic ideas themselves are, of course, quite old. They go back at least as far as Immanuel Kant, but Berlin crystallized them in a way that structured discourse in the decades that followed. The literature has raised a range of issues with Berlin's formulation and wording, actually even whether when he says negative, he should be saying positive, when he says positive, he should be saying negative, and so on, and whether there are only two forms of freedom, whether there's a third form of freedom, and so on and so forth. But this is not the place, this is not the time to go into those things in detail. For my purposes, and certainly in my reading and in my thinking, the negative-positive freedom distinction has much to recommend it as an organizing principle, especially if you take a more modern formulation as follows in the work of Chernis and Hardy. They say the following: negative liberty, Berlin initially defined as freedom from, that is, the absence of constraints on the agent imposed by other people. Positive liberty he defined as freedom, as freedom to, that is, the ability to pursue and achieve willed goals. So negative freedom and positive freedom as defined by Berlin, as conceptualized by Berlin in a more modern formulation. Actually, a somewhat colorful illustration of this distinction and linked directly to equality is found in Anatole France's famous dictum in his 1894 novel, Le Lit Rouge. He says, in its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread. A typical Anatole France dictum. Thus, neither poor nor rich are forbidden from begging. They have negative freedom in the Berlin sense. But of course, only one of them has the positive freedom to beg or to not beg. A similar distinction can be drawn in the realm of markets. On the one hand, a free market could be argued to enhance negative freedom if an individual is not prevented from purchasing commodities on the market. But whether the individual in question can actually purchase that commodity in the market, which that individual has complete freedom to go and purchase, that whether or not the individual can actually purchase depends on whether the price can be afforded. Economic resources, therefore, are a key determinant of positive freedom, despite any provisions of negative freedom. Now, the focus of my talk, as I said at the start, is positive freedom. Within economics, and in particular within development economics, the most elaborate and sustained development of the concept of positive freedom, or what he calls substantive freedom, is that by my teacher, Amartya Sen. In particular, Sen, as many people would know, introduced the concepts of functionings and capabilities. A functioning is an achievement, whereas a capability is the ability to achieve. Functionings are, in a sense, more directly related to living conditions. Capabilities, in contrast, are notions of freedom in the positive sense. It's the opportunities you have regarding the life you may lead. So here is Sen relating directly to the Berlin concepts of positive and negative freedom. In particular, the concept of positive freedom. Now, of course, as is well known, Sen himself departs from the narrowly economic conception of well-being in specifying his outcomes, his functionings, which include, for example, being educated, being healthy, and so on. The same is true in his broadening of the notion of capabilities. Voting in an election, which Sen takes to be a functioning, or taking part in a debate is a functioning, is an actual outcome. But having the opportunity to vote or to take part in a debate is a capability. And of course, if there's a formal bar against voting or debating, that would be a violation of negative freedom. But even when there is no such bar, but economic resources constrain the ability to vote, because taking time out to vote would mean loss of desperately needed income, for example, or to engage in debate because lack of access to the internet, then there is loss of positive or substantive freedom or capability, to use Sen's terms. Thus, economic resources are instrumental in delivering capabilities, and economic inequality can then explain differing capabilities, freedom in the positive sense, across different individuals. So this leads us to the question, what then empirically is the relationship between economic inequality and positive freedom? So having discussed and defined economic inequality, having discussed and at least partially defined positive freedom, what is the relationship between them? What do we see empirically? Now, the measurement of freedom is itself a vast topic with many controversies. And negative freedom in particular has spawned many indices, the index of this freedom, that freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, and so on and so forth. And the connection between economic inequality and negative freedom has indeed been analyzed extensively. Again, there's lots of the huge literature, hundreds of papers on this. I just picked one almost at random to give you sort of a techie type paper, a nerdy type paper, to see what sort of analysis one might find. Here it is. It says the study employs panel data from 138 countries with unbalanced time frameworks to investigate the relationship between economic freedom and income inequality. Both linear and nonlinear co-integration methodologies are used, etc., and all sort of techie stuff. And they investigate the relationship in this particular paper between the overall economic freedom of the world index and income inequality. And secondly, major components of the index. And they find, positive relationship in some way, negative relationship other way, and so on and so forth. And that's the second half of that paragraph. And as I said, as you might imagine, there are many such papers in the literature with outcomes ranging from associational relationships to deeper characterizations of causality through statistical analysis. There's a big literature on relating economic inequality to what might be termed negative freedom. But what about positive freedom? You see, an empirical analysis of positive freedom faces an immediate problem in actually measuring what Sen calls freedom in the positive sense, the real opportunities you have regarding the life you may lead. And the difficulty should be obvious, because what we actually observe in our data is outcome, not the set of opportunities from which that outcome came. What we observe is actual school enrollment. What we observe is actual health outcome. What we observe is actual nutrition, and so on. Two individuals could have the same education outcome, but very different, but might have had very different possibilities from education from which that outcome emerged. The set of opportunities is different from the outcome that is chosen, or that comes out of that set of possibilities. But our data only registers the outcome, and that, I think, is a basic empirical difficulty in this literature. Well, faced with this difficulty, one strand, perhaps a major strand of the literature, uses the outcomes, the functioning, the actual outcomes, because that's all you can do, and simply interprets them as representing capabilities or positive freedom. So it looks at the outcomes on education and interprets that as a high level of education is in fact more opportunity. A better level of health is in fact more opportunity to live a better life. A high level of income is in fact provides more opportunities to have more consumption, a broader range of consumption, and so on and so forth. Okay. The famous Human Development Index, for example, although its origins are claimed to lie in Sen's capability approach, in actuality, in actual fact, it is a weighted sum of three outcomes: income, education, and health, which are interpreted as representing capabilities or opportunities. And having done this, the literature then asks how economic inequality impacts these components. And there are technical debates galore, which one can go into, and all sorts of econometric issues and statistical issues and so on. But I think perhaps one can point to a growing consensus that economic inequality, as I defined and discussed earlier in the talk, is at least associated with lower performance on the components of the Human Development Index. In other words, high economic inequality, controlling for everything else, doing the statistical analysis properly, and so on and so forth, is associated with lower values of the components of the Human Development Index, and indeed the index as a whole. Let me just say perhaps the most surprising provenance in recent years for such findings is actually from the International Monetary Fund, the bête noire of many of us, certainly in the past and also in the present. But the recent research from the IMF has investigated the association between economic inequality and economic growth. Again, doing the thing statistically properly. And again, there are lots of debates about whether they've done this right, this data, that data, and so on and so forth. But here's a representative conclusion from this body of work. Across a variety of estimation methods, data samples, and robustness checks, we find, one, lower net inequality is robustly correlated with faster and more durable growth, controlling for the level of redistribution. Redistribution appears to be benign in terms of its impact on growth. This is economic redistribution, okay, except when it is extensive. And three, the channels seem to be the channels seem to be through human capital accumulation and fertility channels. So this is the research of the IMF, which is very well quoted now certainly in the economic literature. In economic inequality lowers economic growth, which is one component of the UNDP's Human Development Index. And in the paper which underlies this lecture, which will be available to you generally, I also talk about the other dimensions. But I thought it would be interesting just to perhaps counterintuitively highlight this fact that it's the IMF which finds that high inequality is detrimental to economic growth. So let me then come to the final part of my talk, which is on policy. Let me start by recapping what we've done. First of all, let me just clarify again that my focus in this talk is not on academic freedom in the sense of freedom of speech, of deplatforming, cancel culture, and all that. I have no special or deep knowledge to bring to these questions, important as they are. Rather, I have considered the role of economic resources and economic inequality as a determinant of freedom in the positive sense. Freedom, too, that is the ability to pursue and achieve willed goals. This is in no way, I have to say again, this is in no way to deny the importance of negative freedom. Prohibition, whether formal or informal, of participating in academic activity for certain individuals or groups has been a central feature of many political systems and societies and continues to be so. We are, after all, at the TB Davie Memorial Lecture. But even when there are no such restrictions, and this is the point I want to emphasize, even when there are no such restrictions, the inequality of resources shapes opportunities in education and in the world of ideas generally, and it is this that I wish to highlight and discuss. So, if indeed there is this connection between inequality and positive freedom, it leads to a major policy question. If household economic resources determine access to and performance in the academic sector, and public resources devoted to the academic sector also determine access to and performance within the academic sector, which should be targeted if the objective is to equalize academic opportunity and thus enhance academic freedom and equality of academic freedom? Should you go for policies targeted towards academic inequality? And that's obviously an obvious first step. But I want to argue that going beyond this, that general policies towards economic inequality are an important complement, and in some cases can be as powerful, and if I was making a strong argument, I would say even dominant, in ensuring academic freedom through reducing academic inequality. Let me illustrate my argument. But before I do that, let me also say that to focus just on policies that target inequalities within the academic sector, within higher education or within education, I believe could lead us to fall into a trap which is set by a certain strand of the equality of opportunity line of thinking. And I have debated this point with others in the literature. An argument has developed in recent years that public policy should refrain from redistributing income or wealth, but focus on quote unquote equalizing opportunity through equal provision of high quality education. So let me just say that again. The argument is made, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it in the public discourse, that public policy should refrain from redistributing income or wealth, but focus on equalizing opportunity through equal provision of high quality education. And the reasoning is twofold. First, it is argued that there are economic incentive effects from redistributing income or wealth, which would affect efficiency and growth. This is an argument that sits quite well in the economic discourse, of course, and it is well known that the so-called Merle's Review in the United Kingdom, which analyzed these sorts of factors and was in fact instrumental in the top marginal tax rate in the UK being brought down at the time of the Conservative government. So that's the first argument, that don't redistribute income or wealth that much because it'll have incentive effects, and one could debate that, and I have indeed debated that position. But the second, perhaps equally powerful argument that is made is that actually what one should do, all that one should do legitimately is to provide an equal starting point through education, and then let income and wealth develop through effort and initiative, and let the chips fall where they may. So this is a very powerful argument for saying, let's focus on equalizing opportunities in education, but leave broader economic inequalities to one side. And I, in my writings, and this paper with the Haparanta et al., I'm a co-author of this, we have questioned this line of reasoning in the context of a formal economic model of optimal taxation, but I want to give a general account of that argument. Now, our conceptualization is general enough to cover all education, but is also applicable to higher education and to academia. So see, what we do is we envisage academic educational outcomes for an individual as being a function of two types of inputs, and it's intuitively obvious, the public inputs and the private inputs. They go together through some sort of a relationship to produce the actual educational outcomes that we observe. And policymakers have a choice of how equal to make the public inputs and perhaps how to address the private inputs, and I'll come to that. We know that public inputs are hugely unequal. And again, I'm going to come to that. But suppose for the sake of argument, that in fact public inputs were equal, that there was equal access, and there was equality of quality conditional on access. Suppose for the moment we imagine a world of that type. We argue in the paper that even in that case, where public inputs are equal, and this should be intuitively obvious, there will indeed be unequal educational outcomes because of unequal private inputs, which flow from unequal household resources. That should be fairly clear and fairly obvious, and it's an empirical regularity, the relationship between unequal household resources and unequal educational outcomes, controlling for public inputs. But here's another point. There's the further question of how resources are to be raised for the provision of this equal public education. Suppose, in fact, we say, okay, we're going to make public education equal, and that's all that we want to do. Where are those resources going to come from? Those resources have to be raised from the general population. And you could raise those resources in a progressive manner or a regressive manner. So you cannot evade the question of economic inequality simply by saying, I'm going to focus on equal provision of education. Because even to provide that equal provision of education, you have to raise the funds. And that immediately raises the question, are you going to raise these funds in an equalizing or a disequalizing manner? So combining these things together, we argue, the Haparanta paper argues, that progressive taxation is a potent instrument for equalizing opportunity through equalizing education outcomes. When education outcomes are highly sensitive to parental inputs relative to public provision, paradoxically, the case for progressive taxation tends to be stronger, even with the equality of opportunity objective. Plus, of course, I also made the point above about how you're going to raise the resources progressively or regressively. Now, all of the above is if public inputs to academia themselves do not have built-in inequalities. Okay. However, this is manifestly not the case, and I talked about endowments of US universities. Let me take that as an example. Taking the case of US as a leading example, the endowment per pupil at Princeton is $3.1 million. At Yale, it's $2.3 million. Harvard is $1.6 million. Stanford, $1.5 million. And my own university, Cornell, comes low in that ranking, with endowment per pupil is about $300,000. Only $300,000, only, quote unquote. But you may say, but surely, someone might say, but surely these are private resources. You know, isn't this inequality of private inputs? What's this got to do with the public policy? Well, the point is that these endowments, as I said earlier, enjoy tax-free status because of their educational mission. These endowments enjoy tax-free status because of their educational mission. And moreover, wealthy individuals who donate to these universities also enjoy tax breaks on that donation, as they do for donations to foundations, which in turn support research at universities. With Indranil Dasgupta, I have argued that such tax breaks for philanthropy can indeed increase inequality. And Bob Reich at Stanford is among those who argues that such tax breaks are regressive. Just to quote what he says, in actuality, American philanthropy and that of most other countries is supported by taxpayers through tax concessions. The court of the tax deduction remains the same, a subsidy in proportion to the tax rate of the donor. And he says, he's talking about a few other things besides university, but he says, clearly something has gone wrong when taxpayers are subsidizing Bill Gates' check writing more heavily than your neighborhood boys club membership. So just to repeat again, not only are the endowments of the rich universities so first of all, not only are these rich universities geared towards admitting the children of the very rich, their endowments are exempt from taxation, and donations to those endowments produce tax breaks for the wealthy individuals who donate. So a tax regime which is regressive thus goes hand in hand with unequal giving to the wealthiest universities. Policies targeting economic inequality in general have powerful consequences for academic inequality. There's no way to separate those two out. I can see that I'm coming towards the end of my time, so let me conclude. Let me conclude by reviewing the arguments that I've advanced in this paper. I started by examining trends in economic inequality. I argued that although the fundamental forces of physical and human capital accumulation, combined with technological change, are making for rising inequality, the actual patterns of inequality around the world are actually more intricate and nuanced. In the large countries of the world, and in countries where the majority of the world's population live, inequality as conventionally measured has indeed risen. But there are many cases where it has fallen. And the variation in outcomes is the variation in the nature and degree of policy towards these forces. And because policy has varied across countries, outcomes have varied across countries. Policy matters. The patterns of education and academic inequality are also nuanced. On the one hand, inequality in levels of education as measured by years of schooling has declined globally, driven in large part by increased enrollments from the bottom upwards. But there are big caveats to this. This refers to the quantity of education, not its quality, and inequality within that sector remains high, and achievements are closely associated with the economic resources of the household from which the student comes. My focus in this essay is on freedom and academic freedom in the positive sense. Having freedom in the negative sense, not being forbidden to do certain things, is important. But even if there's no formal provision against participation, economic resources nevertheless determine access to and engagement with academic education and research. In other words, freedom in the positive sense. Thus, economic inequality, which is a determinant of academic inequality, is in turn a determinant of positive academic freedom and positive freedom more generally. Finally, as I said in my last section, while a natural response to the constraints which academic inequality poses to positive academic freedom is to address this inequality directly, an important complement to this, and in some cases, if I want to make a strong argument, perhaps dominating it, is addressing economic inequality in general. At the very least, raising of resources to address academic inequality cannot be divorced from economic inequality in general. The resources can be raised in a progressive or a regressive manner. And further, even if access to the academic sector is equal, inequality of overall educational outcomes is dependent on inequality of household resources. Thus, as I stated at the start, economic inequality begets academic inequality and is then sustained by it. Since the underlying economic forces of our time are geared towards rising inequality, policy has to be targeted purposively to addressing and countering these forces to enhance positive freedom, including academic freedom in the positive sense. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Kanbur. That was absolutely, thought-provoking and in many ways sobering, offering nuance not only in how to understand inequality at a global level, within and across countries, and between groups, but also how we could use policy in a targeted manner to enhance positive freedom, including academic freedom in the positive sense. We now open the question and answer session with questions from the floor to lead the conversation as Professor Kanbur engages us further. I have noted a number of questions. I've noted questions that Jennifer asked. She asked 2 questions, and there was Vili, Monica, David, and JH. And it seems like we can collapse some of the questions into a few broad questions that we will start off with. And these really bring us to our local context, Africa as a continent, but also South Africa. And the question is, how would one describe the rising inequality in this context and explain it? So that's the first question. And a build up to that is, how then do we make a positive turnaround, especially after years of apartheid? The third question that is linked to that is around the role of indebtedness for students. So even as we acknowledge that education is meant to address economic inequality, one can't help but note that debt for some often creates a cycle of inequality that seems hard to break. So I will stop at those 3 questions, and then we will see what other questions came forth. There's one other question from JH that we will come back to.
Thank you very much indeed for those questions. And so the question of thinking about inequality within Africa, and particularly within South Africa, I should say that also the picture within Africa of the conventional measures of economic inequality that I talked about is not uniform. It's mixed. Recent reports have looked at, for different countries, things have moved in different ways. Okay, and again, it's because policy differs, and I suppose also you could say the forces playing on these countries maybe differ because of the degree of openness and so on. So that's the first point to say, is that in fact there are these differences across countries. Now, linking it to, so what are these forces? Let me just go back to what these forces are. One way to think about, a very simple way to think about economic inequality is to think of an asset, a return on that asset, and the income that produces. So you have an asset times the return on the asset produces the income. You can have that. The asset can be physical asset, it can be land, it can be human asset, and the rate of return to human asset is, of course, the wage premium that you get, and so on. What has been happening over the last 25 to 30 years, the fundamental forces are that the rates of return to assets have been disequalized dramatically. This is the skill bias technical progress on the human capital side, but also capital returns and so on and so forth. Okay, so we've found that income inequality has been rising because the inequality in the rates of return has been rising as well. So what is the counter to this? And this relates to the second question now. Well, clearly, if you have asset inequality, rate of return inequality, leading to income inequality or economic inequality, then you can address those things by, first of all, addressing asset inequality, and that immediately leads to human capital inequality and education inequality. So this is why I think that's an extremely important, and I said academic inequality begets economic inequality. In terms of rates of return inequality, that's very tricky. That is to do with how do we change the trajectory of technical change, and that's a global phenomenon. That would be quite difficult for a single country to address. That has to be a global effort. But thirdly, the outcome, the income inequality that actually emerges from this thing, I think we have to be much more progressive in our income redistribution policies in order to correct the consequences of the current trends. Let me turn to the indebtedness question, and again, this is extremely important. I'm afraid I don't know the detailed situation in South Africa, but in the US, student debt is a huge issue, and again, essentially, it's a bigger burden, it's a greater burden proportionately on lower income households. So one answer to this thing would be, and many politicians in the US have proposed, essentially forgiving all debt all student debt that has accumulated. But I come back to this point that even if you have equalization of the public inputs, which of course we should do, the inequality in private inputs drives educational outcome inequality. And I think we have to then focus on economic inequality in general, as well as addressing the specific questions of indebtedness and so on, which are to do with inequality within the academic sector. I'm happy to elaborate, but that's a first cut at those three questions. I'm happy to come back to those if I've missed out on something or something's not clear.
So we have picked up other questions.
Sure.
There's an interesting question around, taxing the philanthropists.
Mm-hmm.
And the question there is, why would we be unhappy with tax breaks if the philanthropy is what universities need?
Yeah.
And I think we can tackle that on its own, because I think it's probably a question that needs quite a bit of elaboration.
Yes. So let me elaborate on that. And again, of course, we can have a general discussion on this, and then there are various technical issues of how you actually design a tax regime and so on. Let's keep those things separate. But let me perhaps caricature the situation in the US in the following way, and it may or may not reflect the situation in South Africa. So first of all, we allow these huge fortunes to be built up by the Gateses of the world, by these very, very wealthy people, by not taxing them sufficiently. Then, when they form their foundations, we give them tax breaks in the formation of those foundations. And then when they give money to universities and so on, we further give them tax breaks on this thing. Okay? So in a way, my own view is that this is inequality piled upon inequality piled upon inequality. Yeah? My basic argument is that we should be addressing economic inequality at its core. Now, you may say, it's okay, philanthropy, of course, is a range of things, and how about contributing to, as indeed the quote that I gave from Reich talks about it, giving to the local clubs and so on and so forth. That's very different, I think, from the Gates Foundation or from other big foundations giving money, or from big endowments like Harvard's and so on, or Cornell's being tax exempt.
And then there is a question around inheritance.
Yes.
This has been a very hot topic in South Africa currently. And there's a question there from Gary asking, would you advocate for inheritance to be done away with in its current form in order to help reduce inequality?
So I suppose, how would we reduce inheritance? We would tax it. Okay. The policy response to so first of all, let me just back up and say that again, the transmission of economic advantage over generations is a very well established phenomenon. We read about it in the novels, in our literature, in our films, and so on. But when you go to the detailed analysis of someone like Raj Chetty, who has looked at the tax returns of households going back 30, 40, 50 years, I mean, the transmission of family advantage from one generation to another is extremely strong. And there are many aspects of this, but one aspect of this is the transmission of wealth advantage, which is inheritance. So it seems to me that if one has those objectives of egalitarian objectives, then inheritance taxation is absolutely crucial, I would say. Now, what rate you fix it at, how you bring it in, what should be the graduation, and so on. These are all technical issues that we can discuss. But I think as a going-in position, my going-in position would be, yes, substantial inheritance taxation has to be, particularly in this era of rising inequality, of rising income inequality, and also rising wealth inequality, has to be an important component. In my view, there's no two ways about it.
All right. Taking further questions. There's a very provocative question around the idea of capitalism itself. And the question from Edward is capitalism ever the answer in reducing inequality? And I'm going to add two more questions, and you perhaps can tackle them one after another. So the first one is around capitalism. And the second question from Shuaib is whether there are policies that you could suggest that would meaningfully enhance transformation within universities, particularly in South Africa, that could help address inequality. And the third question that I'm bringing in this round is from Sienna, and it brings in a different dimension, and it looks at people with disabilities. And the question is, what academic freedom is there for the visually impaired, especially when access to the content involving economics may be inaccessible to people that would struggle because of the impairment. If we are to advance freedom, especially in relation to individual freedoms, what policies could we look at in order to promote such freedoms?
So the big structural question is capitalism ever the answer, and so on, to rising inequality, etc. again, let me be honest. I actually don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer the question. But here are some observations that I'll make. I said to you that actually in many countries around the world, particularly the big Latin American economies, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, all these countries, which are capitalist economies, for a period of 20 odd years, inequality is conventionally measured fell. And these were the countries which are following in some sense the same capitalist model, being subject to the same forces of globalization and so on. The thing was that policies were different in those countries. They had active labor market policies, they had other policies, redistributive policies, and so on. And again, there's a big literature on this, and that's been analyzed. So that would be one sort of response to this question. That in fact, within capitalist society, and indeed the US, I talked about the US from 1945 to 1975, a 30-year period of falling inequality. The same measures, the same methods, the same techniques that have shown an increase in inequality were decreasing for the first 30 years after the Second World War. Okay, and that was a sort of a capitalist economy in full flow. So my first answer is I don't have an answer to the question, but my second answer is consider these variations and let's think about them. In terms of policies within South Africa, again, I haven't thought very deeply about this, but let me just say that I think the general line that I was taking, I think applies equally to South Africa, which is that there are these two strategies. One is addressing inequalities within the academic sector, and clearly they exist. Clearly, we know the differences across universities and so on and so forth. But equally, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that inequalities in the society as a whole beget those academic inequalities. In fact, those inequalities are mirror inequalities in the society. So while we can have very specific discussions and specific policies and so on and so forth on debt, on this and that, I think in many ways the bigger picture, the bigger game is general inequalities in society. Let me turn finally to the question from Sienna on disabilities and so on. And again, very important point. And actually, the whole notion of the whole context of individuals with disabilities was extremely important, actually, in Sen's conceptualization of capabilities and so on. And very clearly, and that's present a little bit in the economic analysis. In economic analysis, when we talk about needs of different individuals in measuring well-being and so on. So first of all, I think given the specific needs of individuals with disabilities, clearly their positive freedom is constrained by those. There's no question about it. And just as low economic resources constrain your academic freedom, disabilities constrain your academic freedom. And we have to think about structural responses to that. I mean, one straightforward thing is to use economic resources to bridge some of those gaps. But for example, in the US, which again, to praise the US for a change, there's something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I don't know whether the set provisions have reached South Africa or not. But for example, in Cornell now, when we do online teaching, when we're going online, all our online materials have to conform to the so-called ADA, the ADA provisions, Americans with Disabilities Act provisions. Okay. And similarly, when Cornell puts stuff up on its websites, they have to conform to those provisions, which again, I don't know the technical details of the specific provisions, but the intent, at any rate, is to make online material accessible to those who would not have had access to it in the past.
So I'm going to just make one comment, because what your response touched on now links to a question that was asked by Leslie about the role of policies that are meant for redress. And in South Africa, he makes the point about how the distinction between public and private resources and the limits of aiming for equalization of public resources should be really be part of that should also be about redress and looking at the economic imperative of such policies such as economic employment equity and affirmative action as key for economic growth. So I'm just going to make a comment rather than pose it as a question. And then the last question is around networks and to what extent networks that give some people access to funding for research could serve as deepening and perpetuating inequality, particularly within the academy. And that will be the last question we ask before we close.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's no question really that that networks are important, are crucial. Economists talk about externalities, economic externalities, the environment and so on, environmental economics. But there is the concept that Mark Flerbet and I have been working on called social externalities, okay, which is the impact of groups of individuals on each other, both for the both positive and negative. And there are indeed these networks which support each other in academia, and Mark and I have argued that actually those networks can be very disequalizing because in fact they congeal in particular ways. So I would in fact agree with that the role of networks is extremely important. And actually this comes out, for example, in the work of Raj Chetty and others who are looking at very localized residential impact on the outcomes for children, for education outcomes for children, correcting for everything else, controlling for everything else, being in a locality and a network with other children of the same type has an effect over and above all the other things. So certainly there's empirical evidence for this, and it's intuitively obvious, and I think it's an important policy question. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have now reached the end of our event tonight with a few closing remarks to offer. And that is to say, academic freedom is about more than just hearing new ideas. We have a responsibility to interrogate those ideas and, where possible, turn them into tangible outcomes to create a more socially just world. Professor Kanbur has shown very clearly this evening that academic freedom and contestation around it cannot be the reserve of scholars or researchers in the humanities or social sciences. Economists, too, have a responsibility to reflect on how their research and scholarship broadly speak to societal issues. In the current context, deepening inequality must concern us all globally. For reminding us of this, we wish to offer you, Professor Kanbur, our profound gratitude. I also wish to thank Professor Harun Borat, UCT's Professor of Economics and Director of the Development Policy Research Unit, an outgoing member of the Academic Freedom Committee, as well as the Faculty of Commerce here at UCT, for having played a central role in identifying our distinguished speaker for tonight. We could not have chosen better for someone to do justice to the topic presented tonight, a very timely and necessary topic given the current context. This bodes well for the memory of TB Davie, to whom this memorial lecture is dedicated. My gratitude also goes to all other members of the outgoing Academic Freedom Committee. I know that we can look back to the past 4 years with pride having elevated the intellectual debate on academic freedom in clearly demonstrable ways. This we managed through a very well-considered approach to select highly regarded academics and scholars whose work is also socially engaged. I also wish to thank our communications and marketing department, particularly the team that has always been on the mark in making sure that we host an event that the university community and the nation can be proud of. Gratitude also goes to the Office of the Vice Chancellor, specifically our Vice Chancellor, for the prestige that comes with co-hosting the TB Davie Memorial Lecture with the office. Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for always being your authentic self in both your presence and intellectually engaging introductory notes. Lastly, and more importantly, I wish to thank you, our audience, supporting the TB Davie Memorial Lecture through your presence. Passionate, robust, and yet rational engagement makes it worthwhile to serve this institution, the University of Cape Town. With those words, I wish to close this event and wish everyone a pleasant evening further. Thank you.